Welcome back. I'm going to continue talking today about the concept of scholarly rigidity, critical scholarly rigidity. Some of the content in this series will be content you may have heard from me before, but I'm putting it here into this context of the way that it demonstrates scholarly rigidity on the critical side. So, who is being unnuanced, who is being rigid? Often it is the person insisting that there is a contradiction if these documents are to be taken to be literally true, insisting that they cannot be traditionally harmonized, and insisting that therefore one side or the other must have changed it deliberately. And today I'm going to be talking about Bart Ehrman, and I'm going to be using him to illustrate what I'm going to call the rigid rule of first impressions. I consider that a big piece of the new content here. This is a phrase I just thought of that I hope will stick with you because it comes up so often. It came up in the video I did last week on Jesus' words from the cross. The rigid rule of first impressions would mean that if you read Luke and it says something like, having said this, he breathed his last, okay, your first impression is that he didn't say anything else quietly while he was breathing his last, but you don't have to hold on to that, okay? It's a rigid rule to say they can't be harmonized. It's very artificial to harmonize them if you abandon what your first impression would be. So the rigid rule of first impressions goes like this. Take these documents in isolation from one another. Read them in isolation. Get a first impression of what happened on some specific point. Fix that first impression in stone. Then go read the other document. Get a first impression. Fix that first impression in stone. And then if these stone-fixed first impressions from the documents are incompatible, then say, oh, well, there is a contradiction here and it would be terribly artificial to harmonize. But what's actually artificial is the rigid rule of first impressions, that you fix that first impression in stone. So let me just give you a kind of day-to-day example. Suppose that my husband were speaking of a mutual friend of ours, someone who lives here in town, and he who helps us with our yard work. And suppose my husband were to say, I talked to him about that, some specific matter of our yard work, and he said this, and I said this, and so we agreed on that, okay? He might even say to me, yesterday I talked to him about that. All right, my first impression from this, since the friend lives here, might be that they spoke in person. Tim often does see this friend in person, so it would be very easy. So I might have gone away with that first impression. Then let's suppose that I'm speaking to someone else who says about the man who helps with our yard work, well, he was out of town yesterday. He was in Fort Wayne, Indiana yesterday. Now, if he was in Fort Wayne, Indiana, all day yesterday, he couldn't have been talking in person with Tim, right? So if I fix in stone that first impression that I walked away with because he used the word talked to, that they spoke in person, then when I hear he was in Fort Wayne, Indiana yesterday, now I have a contradiction. But it's only a contradiction with that first impression. The natural thing to do, of course, now when we have so many other means of communication, is to say to myself, talk to, maybe it was on by cell phone, or maybe they texted back and forth. We can get a very natural kind of conversation going even with texting, right? Where it could be in real time. I said this and he said that and I said this. Okay, so talked to could refer to a text message conversation. I correct that first impression, and now I don't even have to think that Tim made a mistake. Now, that would be another possibility if there really were a conflict, that maybe he made a minor good faith error, and actually it was the day before yesterday or something like that. But I don't even have to go there, because he could have talked with him yesterday by one of these other means of communication. But if I follow the rigid rule of first impressions, I can't change that first impression. I have to say, oh boy, there's got to be a contradiction here. It may not be, maybe I won't say, oh boy, but just, oh, I guess there's a contradiction. Might not be a big deal, but that's not actually the most reasonable thing to do. The most reasonable thing to do is to correct that first impression, not to fix it in stone. Fixing it in stone is the rigidity. Fixing it in stone is the artificiality. So with that in mind, I want to read a quotation from something by Bart Ehrman. If you follow these matters, I'm sure you've heard Bart Ehrman saying that if you harmonize, you're writing your own gospel, right? One of his favorite lines. But I want you to see how he's teaching the rigid rule of first impressions here, and even giving the impression that it's the only way to be kind or charitable, or to follow the golden rule in relation to the gospel authors. That was news to me. I'm going to skip a place where Ehrman does what all anti-harmonizers do, and I'll probably have another video about this. Christians as well as skeptics, if they're doing this critical scholarly anti-harmonization thing, you can bet your money they're going to go into a little riff about whether Peter denied Jesus 6 times. And they're going to mock, they're going to bring up the silliest example, trying to, a way that you might try to harmonize. Sometimes an example that, no one nowadays uses. I believe someone actually did suggest that Peter denied Jesus 6 times, but for other things, they just kind of make it up as they go along in order to make fun. So Ehrman's just done that. All right. Then he continues, but in a more serious vein, I have to say that I find it highly objectionable, by which he means harmonizing the Gospels. The reason is this: those who take what one gospel says, combine it with what another gospel says, and thereby create the true and real, scare quotes are there, story/gospel, have not interpreted the gospels as they have come down to us. They have instead created their own gospel, writing a new one that is completely unlike any of the gospels of the NT. Of course, anyone and everyone is free to do this. It's a free country. But realize that once you do that, you're refusing to read the Gospels as they were produced, and have produced an alternative version of your own, one that isn't in the Bible, and one that never existed before you created it. The real problem with that is that this destroys the integrity of each of the Gospels as they stand. That's a serious accusation. And in the process, robs each of the authors of these Gospels of his own unique understanding of who Jesus was and what he said and did. Surely it is not the best way to read a book to make it say something other than it says in order to understand it better. We don't do this with other literature. No one would take a book that I have written, combine it with a book that Jerry Falwell or Dan Brown or even N.T. Wright or Dominic Crossan has written, and then claim that that is what I really meant all along. So why do it with the Gospels? Why pretend that Luke has to be interpreted in light of John, or Mark in light of Matthew, and so on? The reason people do this is because the Gospels, separate books, came to us as a collection within the covers as one book. But again, we don't do that with other anthologies of texts. We don't take a collection of American short stories and pretend that the way to understand a story by Mark Twain is to combine what it says with a story by Stephen Crane. We could read books that way, but we don't. And why? Because we assume that Mark Twain has something different to say from Stephen Crane. But the same is true of the NT Gospels. Each author has his own point of view, and we rob him of his perspective and his integrity as an author when we pretend otherwise. Close quote. Okay, where to begin here? So notice that he's immediately going to a supposed motive or cause for trying to harmonize the Gospels, which is that they've come down to us within the covers of the same book, which we call the Bible. Now, that not so subtly portrays harmonizers ignorant. It really does. It's a sneer. that, you're just saying the Bible, the Bible, the Bible, and not recognizing that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are by separate authors and within this thing that we call, this compilation that we call the Bible. But of course, there have been many harmonizers that are fully aware of that. They're not ignorant, and that's not why they're doing it. I'm not even an inerrantist, and I harmonize the Gospels all the time. Why? Because that's very responsible historical practice. So that sneer just completely misses the mark, but it's some people might find it subtle. I find it not so subtle way of kind of pushing the audience. They don't want to seem like these ignoramuses who are just calling it the Bible and not realizing that we have 4 different authors here. Okay, the next thing he does is to pick genres that aren't even what the Gospels present themselves as being, and then to make it sound like those are the proper analogs. So the first genre would be what we might call ideological literature, or not something about history that one has experienced oneself, but rather where you're giving your opinions on some kind of topic like theology or something like that, what we might call meta-level literature. So his writings, Ehrman's own writings, John Dominic Cross and N.T. Wright. Okay, these guys are not themselves writing an account of some historical events that they or even their friends were involved in, and all writing their accounts of similar events in history that happened at the same time and covered the same territory historically. That's not what these are. If you wanted to be a little less far off, I suppose Ehrman could try to use this analogy of combining what he said and trying to make it compatible with what Jerry Falwell said by an analogy to the letters, the epistles of James and the epistle to the Romans. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that I believe James and Romans are theologically incompatible. I'm just saying that would be a better genre for him to use this analogy for. But it's completely irrelevant when we're talking about the gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, because they're all talking about the same guy, Jesus, and the same event, his being crucified, and the same, for other things, the events of his life. They're talking about his life and ministry. So an analogy to trying to make Bart Ehrman agree with Jerry Falwell is completely off topic. All right. Then another analogy he uses is an anthology of fiction, acknowledged fiction, fiction that presents itself as fiction, fiction that doesn't pretend to be anything other than fiction. Stephen Crane, Mark Twain. Beg the question much, Bart? Obviously, we don't expect Mark Twain to be writing in the same story world as Stephen Crane, because they're both writing fiction, they're creating different stories, but that's precisely the question at issue with respect to the Gospels. We're not, he's not allowed to assume that, but he does seem to be assuming it when he gives this analogy to an anthology of fictional works. We're trying to decide if these are fictional, or even if they're partly fictional, if they're sometimes changing the facts at all. And then by way of these bad analogies, Bart tries to make it sound like he's being courteous to the gospel authors. He's saving their integrity as authors, and that to harmonize them would be to rob them of their integrity as authors. Let's go back to the analogy I used at the beginning, to Tim's telling me that he talked to our friend yesterday about something to do with the yard work at our house. If I decide later that he must mean that he talked to him, or he must have talked to him by some non-in-person means, telephone, text message, email, whatever, am I robbing Tim of his integrity as an author? Am I doing something uncharitable? Am I violating the golden rule? This is what Ehrman's implying, right? well, Bart Ehrman, would not want people to try to make my books compatible with something written by Jerry Falwell, so therefore I should do unto the gospel authors as I would have others to do unto me, right? Am I violating the golden rule when I say, oh, he must have talked to him some other way? Of course not. On the contrary, I am obeying the golden rule. If I said I talked to so-and-so and someone just got the impression accidentally that I talked to him in person and then he was out of town, I would want that person to just shift in the seamless fashion that we do all the time. Oh, she must have talked to him some other way. That's not violating my integrity as an author of that conversation. So what is Bart doing? He's leaving completely out of consideration the way that the Gospels present themselves, which is as factual history and other types of communication that would be a better analogy for how they present themselves. Might be reading serious historians, talking with friends about recent events, reading memoirs, listening to a veteran telling his experiences during the Gulf War, etc. Oral history, oral memoir. All of these would be better analogs for at least what the Gospels present themselves as being than Mark Twain or a polemical book by Bart Ehrman, Jesus Interrupted, for example. That's a terrible analog for the Gospels themselves. And by so doing, not only does he give a false impression of what is charitable to do, but he also gives a false impression that harmonizers are doing something bizarre and unprecedented. We don't do this, we don't do that, he says. We don't do this with other anthologies of texts, he says. So it's a kind of misdirection, okay? Because as a matter of fact, in reading history, listening to oral history, oral memoir from someone who was there, just talking to people about what happened yesterday, we all the time harmonize, okay, constantly. But he gives this notion that there's this special Christian-y weird thing that harmonizers of the Gospels are doing. And that notion that this is a special Christian-y weird thing, it's pervasive. It's so pervasive, and it leads to a kind of sneering, a kind of downplaying, and it leads to guilt on the part of Christians who go into scholarship and who are mocked for this, or who just hear this. It's pervasive. And so then they start saying, well, as a Christian, I believe that, they might say, as a Christian, I believe that the Gospels agree, but, as a scholar, I can't do that. Or they may go the direction of fact-changing literary devices that I've talked about so often, because then, actually they're not agreeing, but you're saying it's okay because it was a literary device somehow. But I believe that if we're going to talk about an influence here, a big influence is that feeling that if you harmonize, you're doing something that is historically suspect, something that is intellectually arising from your theological commitments. Notice how often when Christians talk about this, they start by saying, harmonization arises from a certain view of inerrancy, and we don't have to adopt that view. But that's not true. Harmonization certainly doesn't have to arise from a certain view of inerrancy at all. It doesn't have to arise from theological assumptions at all. Now, we see this rigid rule of first impressions again and again and again. And I don't know whether I'm always going to bring it up, but I hope you'll start noticing it. I would go so far as to say the majority, maybe even the vast majority, of anti-harmonization claims are based on the rigid rule of first impressions. I just talked about it in relation to the words on the cross. Or what about the Easter stories? All right, if you read Matthew, your first impression would be that Jesus first saw his male disciples in Galilee. that he hadn't seen his male disciples before that. That's simply because Matthew doesn't narrate anything else, but he doesn't say they went immediately either, but just, Matthew's silent. And of course, you're not going to evolve an entire intervening incident when you have no reason to believe in an intervening incident. Okay, so your first impression from Matthew would be that they first saw him on a mountain in Galilee. Now, I believe there's even a little clue there that would tend to say that maybe that's not the case, because he says that they went to the mountain that Jesus had told them of. And nowhere does he record Jesus telling them of a mountain. He records Jesus saying, I'll meet you in Galilee after I'm raised, though even then he doesn't say for the first time, I'll meet you in Galilee. But there's no record of him telling them about this mountain. So maybe I'm not going to die on a hill or a mountain for this, but it's not implausible that Jesus told them about that mountain at an intervening post-resurrection appearance. But okay, your first impression would be his first appearance to them is on this mountain in Galilee. But you don't have to set that in stone. When you read in Luke and in John that he first saw his gathered, assembled male disciples on the evening of Easter Day, Easter Sunday, you can say, oh, I guess Matthew just decided to go tell us about this appearance in Galilee first. You don't have to insist that it's the same meeting. It's obviously different. All the circumstances are very different. And you certainly don't have to then take the further step after unwarrantably assuming it's the same meeting, then saying, oh, but there are all these differences, so now this is a contradiction. Don't do any of that. All right, you can correct that first impression from Matthew. Oh, okay, I guess that wasn't the first meeting. And come to think of it, Matthew doesn't actually say it was the first meeting. So it's just a difference of emphasis. It's not even a contradiction in what they say. And this comes up, again and again and again. Ehrman famously says Jesus is silent throughout his crucifixion. Of course, that's cherry-picked anyway, because Jesus isn't silent when he's speaking to the high priest, for example. He isn't silent when they come to arrest him in the garden, so he has to start it, at a certain point. But then he's silent, Ehrman says, in Mark, until he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then he spins out this whole idea about Jesus doesn't know why he's dying, and he dies in mental agony and anguish in Mark, and this is in contradiction to Luke when Jesus is recorded as saying a lot more things. What's that doing, though? It's a combination of the argument from silence and the rigid rule of first impressions. If all you had was Mark and you read it, because he doesn't record any other sayings, okay, you might be like, well, maybe he didn't say anything else. Okay, but you should hold that very lightly. You should not be, you should be willing to just correct that in a moment, because nowhere does Mark claim to be giving an exhaustive account of everything Jesus said during this interval or when he's on the cross. Okay, so you should be ready to correct that when you read the other Gospels. So, it is this Ehrman-esque rigid rule that creates situations where scholars, unfortunately even some Christian scholars, feel that a harmonization is strained when the harmonization really is not strained, because they're perceiving the alleged strain against a rigidly fixed first impression. Now, of course, there are going to be differences of opinion about when a harmonization is strained, but we're going to multiply strained cases, or quote-unquote strained cases, things we claim are strained, or say are strained, or feel are strained, far beyond what is reasonable when we adopt the rigid rule of first impressions. And in so doing, we're going to be thinking that it would be somehow wrong to accept a perfectly natural correction. What is really strained, not respecting an author's intentions, not respecting an author's integrity, is to adopt this rigid rule of first impressions and then conclude that the documents are not trying to be historical, when they clearly are trying to be historical. So let's think about that and not be bulldozed by these tacit, rigid rules that come from critical scholarship. Thanks for watching. Please hit like. Please subscribe if you haven't, and invite others to watch this channel. I'm Lydia McGrew.